If we talk about the exports, we are doing pretty good right now at the moment. So 23% growth is pretty okay for us right now.
Yeah, these are decent numbers. I haven't looked at them by sector of the economy. I suspect that a fair bit of it is probably just due to the rather big increase in timber prices that we've seen this year. So for instance, in May, early June, timber prices were up nearly 300% of where they were just last year. Now they've come down a little bit more since then, but I suspect that this added quite a bit to your export earnings. But that's not to say that there are not other areas as well that are seeing gains. I think, in the past 5, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years, maybe even, we've been seeing some increasing complexity in Latvia's economy. And this is a very good thing. It requires a lot more. There are many things that are not being done that really could be done to improve your performance even more. But some encouraging signs after the 2008 crash in terms of how Latvia's economy has developed.
And if we talk about the timber, if that's the main factor, I have also not studied the structure of this growth, but but still I have talked even with the guys who do the timber exports in Latvia. So they are also telling that there is a bubble, and we all know what comes after the bubble. Is the trouble.
Right. Yes, and again, we've already seen some reduction in the price of timber. We'll see how far it goes down. But this year, it's serving Latvia quite well. You're right. One always has to be concerned about just how far will prices come down. But we're seeing a nice recovery in some respects globally. And I suspect that demand for timber is going to continue to be strong. We're not going to see the kinds of prices that we saw again in late spring or early June, but nonetheless, we'll see strong prices. So we won't see the kinds of weak prices that we saw last year. So that's good. But the area that we would want to see increasing strength in is an already strong IT sector or information communication technology. So that's very good. And hopefully we'll continue to see growth there. We've been seeing some benefits to Latvia in terms of what we sometimes call nearshoring of production. So we have German and other West European firms who are looking to bring manufacturing closer to home, not having supply chains that are stretched all the way out to China. COVID has revealed the problems that can occur with that. So, whether it's Poland, whether it's Slovakia, whether it's Romania, or whether it's the 3 countries in the Baltics, we're seeing some benefits there because of that. 2 other areas that I think really need work, and my colleague Kaspars Briškens has been talking about this quite a bit. I think he's absolutely right. One is the need for improved agricultural practices, especially in terms of forming cooperatives. I know that this has a negative connotation in the context of the Soviet past. Yeah, but it's just standard practice. If you take a look at Scandinavia and the Germans, what they've done with agriculture, small farmers, they band together and they form cooperatives to get better prices on whatever inputs they need, and also in terms of getting better prices for what they sell. Same thing in the United States, by the way, and especially with dairy farms, which tend to be a little bit smaller than, say, grain operations. But historically, the United States has really benefited from having this structure as well. So it's a good way to share resources, get better prices, do much better. Also, thinking about ways of marketing some of Latvia's produce a little bit differently, selling fruits and storing them properly. So for instance, with apples, not having to turn them into juice and sell them to the Lithuanians or the Poles to package and then sell back to you, but instead see if you can store these things for several months, put them out into the supermarkets, get better prices. And then lastly, making money cheaper and making it available to both new business startups and for the expansion of already existing enterprises. Now, this has to be done carefully. You want to ensure that you're giving the money to enterprises that can actually absorb the money and do something with it. But the banks have always been very tight with the money here, and they usually require a lot of collateral, more so than many small to medium-sized enterprises have for loans. And then the loans typically are at rates which are a little bit higher. So one of the chief elements of many developing countries' success stories in the past, including with neighbors of yours, such as Germany to the west in the post-World War II period, but also in Scandinavia, also in East Asia with the old tigers, those economies, and even in the United States to some extent, is to have development banks. So state development banks that make money available at good rates to businesses which show promise. Now, of course, you have to make sure that these institutions don't get taken advantage of. There's always the problem of corruption and insiders who will just use these institutions as their own personal piggy banks and take money out of them. But nonetheless, if you don't do it, you're not going to get the benefits from doing it right. If you can do it, and that's what nearly all successful countries have done. They've done it right, and they've seen a good bit of economic growth as a consequence from having those kinds of institutions in place. By the way, Poland, which is, of course, as you know, doing pretty well, is really expanding the use of these kinds of institutions to facilitate economic growth in their own economy.
As you mentioned, the corruption is not the argument to not to do things.
Yeah. In other words, one can always just say that there's corruption, and then
there is some risk of corruption.
Definitely, right. But there's risk in anything. And there's certainly a big risk. Actually, it's not a risk at all. It's a certainty. If you don't do certain things, you won't develop. So there are certain risks that need to be taken, and you need to do everything in your power to reduce the downside risks of occurring. But doing nothing is not the solution. That just leads to, again, very little development. It just takes too long for development to occur in an environment of expensive capital and restricted access to money.
When you mentioned in the very beginning of our conversation about the exports, when you mentioned this structure, that you're happy with the fact that it much more complicated. I have one example when I was discussing the Ukraine case. They want a closer integration with the EU. When I was asking for one guy from Ukraine, what will you do with your economy? You're very close connected to Russia. And their argument was that we are at the moment it's 50-50, like we are exporting some 50% to EU, some 50% to Russia. I thought, yes, of course, if you look at these numbers, yes. But if you look at the structure of what you export, to Russia, you are exporting engines for helicopters or planes. To you, you are exporting apples and other agricultural stuff. So when you were talking about complexity, do you mean that kind of argument?
In part, yes. So you want an industrial economy, of course, as well as a manufacturing economy. And of course, if you take a look at the percentage of Latvia's economy that is comprised of manufacturing, it's always been very, very small, well, at least in the independence period. So roughly some 10% or so, sometimes a little bit above that. So you certainly want to grow that sector. Now, some will argue that manufacturing actually doesn't deliver the same kinds of high profits that it used to. But even if it doesn't, what it does do is it creates kind of a culture of efficiency. So it has both benefits in terms of adding value to the goods that you're selling, but also just in terms of structuring your economy in more efficient ways. it has a very positive effect on an economy to have more manufactured goods. And sometimes we think that, well, we can move to a post-industrial digital economy. And while I see value in the digital economy, the ICT sector, again, there's a lot of benefits to be derived there, and the profit margins tend to be very high. There are also a few barriers to entry into that sector, and at some point, it could become quite saturated. And what we currently see, which is a sector that has, on average, very high profits, could be one that has, on average, very low profits. So, but I also see the digital economy enhanced by manufacturing. You really want this balance in play of different sectors, and that's a type of complexity as well, which helps one ride out cyclical crises in any particular sector. So there's a lot of advantages to building up that manufacturing sector. And the good news is that it is happening in Latvia. Latvia increasingly is getting included again, especially since the 2008 crisis, into more and more of these global supply chains. And what we want to see, of course, now is the development of more Latvian-owned companies. When we take a look at figures like gross domestic product, GDP, it's instructive as a measurement, as an indicator. But we also have to remember that GDP doesn't always equate to national wealth. In other words, GDP includes everything that's produced in the economy. It doesn't tell you how much of that wealth is taken out of the economy by foreign-owned companies. Now, foreign direct investment is a very good thing. It can be, but nonetheless, when a significant portion of your economy is owned by foreign interests, it does mean that a lot of the wealth is being taken out as well. So you certainly want to balance that foreign investment in as much as you can with the development of more local enterprises, where that money stays within the country for the most part, and then eventually, you get so wealthy that you begin investing in other areas which are either poor or richer than you. It really doesn't matter, but where your operations, begin to invest heavily in other countries as well. So that's something that Latvia should strive for.
Is it easy to survive for such a small country as Latvia? We know that, for example, Swiss is a very good example. It's kind of small country, but it has a very strong industry, a lot of very strong companies. As I'm looking now at the Latvian economy, there were a lot of good marketed startups, good ideas to develop and so on, but they simply can't survive because they have very limited resources. And how to survive in these conditions?
It's a very good question that you raise. And just as you say, Switzerland, we often think of it as just an offshore banking location. And of course, it does have that. But it's much more than that. It has a very strong metallurgy sector, very strong pharmaceutical sector. So it has, just as you say, it has very strongly developed industrial sectors. So that's something that certainly one wants to develop. And on one level, you're a bit handicapped with the euro. So I think Poland and
Czech,
Denmark and Sweden and very many other countries have probably done. Romania have done better for themselves by staying outside of the euro. For Latvia, the disadvantages are probably not as great, given that it's really small. So in other words, countries that have to import a lot of their inputs to make things don't suffer as much when they lose currency autonomy. But nonetheless, this is an important tool that you have lost. And a way to make up for that, again, is with these kinds of public credit institutions, which I've referenced, which can make credit available at low cost to new startups and businesses which are looking to expand their operations. So that's really a very big missing element that I think Latvia needs in order for
the logic is, if we can't play with the cost of our currency, we are playing with the rates of the credit. Yes.
At the very least, you want to bring down the cost of money.
Yeah.
And again, this is something that developing countries have done historically in the past, with great success, whether, we're looking at Japan and South Korea and Taiwan after World War II, or, West
Germany, the same Germany.
Germany
it was
an exemplar.
It was the agglomeration of the cartels after the war, what they developed their economy.
Yeah, and again, very similar to what was done in East Asia as well. So, these are, you have to figure out what you can do within the constraints that you have on you. And again, given the inability to create your own money, which again would not be a huge advantage for Latvia, given that it's so small, but nonetheless, it might confer some advantages. And it's a debatable point. But regardless, go with public institutions that can create credit. And again, you monitor them very, very closely, because these are institutions that can be taken advantage of as well. You don't want that. But if done right, they can really help develop your economy.
And the bank of the development bank is the answer in this case.
It's one big answer. I mean, I guess I would still characterize Latvia's economy as one of being saddled with high costs, while at the same time being relatively low income. And you don't want that mix. I mean, you want the opposite, of course. You want high income, low cost. So you need to at least bring your costs down. And by cost, I don't mean just driving the cost of labor down. You don't want to do that. I mean, you do want to increase productivity, of course, but you want to make the cost of money cheaper. I mean, money is like another commodity. It can be cheap or it can be expensive. As you well know from your country's history, I mean, you can have money being lent at terribly high rates, such as was done with the financing of your South Bridge, which was done at scandalously high levels in terms of the interest payments that you had to make. Or, again, you can gain access to that money more cheaply. Now, you need to think about the examples of other countries that have done this and try to emulate them as much as you can.
If we're going back to the theme of the exports, to the very basic principles of the economy. So, do you know any country which got rich not because of the exports?
Well, actually, you mentioned one, and at first it was kind of Switzerland. I mean, but this was a long time ago. When countries were more self-contained, I guess. But you especially with a small country, ultimately, and even if you're a large country, I mean, ultimately you need to expose yourself to export markets and to be competitive on quality and price. Now, that said, but it was a very different period in world history. I mean, even if we're taking a look at just the post-World War II period, or even just a little bit before, we have the development of many, I guess, what we would call national champions, these industrial enterprises that had big protective tariffs that would allow them to develop their own products for quite some time before being exposed to international competition. And then after a certain amount of time, their governments would make adjustments and finally expose them to that competition, and then either they would thrive or not. Now, we've seen many examples historically where this process has failed, where essentially what has happened is that special interests will try and ensure protections are kept in place, and they'll kind of rent seek off the rest of society. So you have to stop that. That's always a danger. But again, there's no alternative to doing this successfully. Not doing anything just ensures that you will slow your economic development. Doing it badly will do the same. So you have to do it well. You have to do it right.
You have to sell more than you're buying to develop things and to increase your income. And that's it. Am I wrong?
You're half wrong, I would say.
Yeah.
In other words, I mean, you certainly don't want perpetual imbalances. I mean, the United States has been able to do this for 40 years, by the way. That's because it has
the United States is a bit different case because
it does. It has a reserve currency. So, yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, right. So you know this. So it has a very special situation. No, but I would say that, especially earlier on in your development, you actually want to be importing more than you're exporting. In other words, but that money and those resources need to be deployed toward development, not consumption. So you want to, as wisely and effectively as you can, use resources to grow your economy. So when you're developing, it's not necessarily a bad thing to be importing more than you're exporting, but you just can't be importing consumer goods. If that's what's driving your trade imbalance, well, that's not going to be a good thing. So it depends upon what you're using those imports for. If you're making better roads, if you're making more efficient electrical grids, if you're putting in place infrastructure to improve transportation, shipping, etc., all things which will reduce costs, well, then that's going to help you out. But in terms of this other high cost, low income calculus that I've referenced, so in addition to making credit available more cheaply, and I know that this is a topic that sometimes makes Latvians uneasy, but your tax code has serious imbalances as well. I mean, you need to shift more of the tax burden off of working people and to put more of it on property, not for the average guy like me or you or somebody that just has a modest home somewhere, or maybe has a modest country house too. I'm not talking about taxing them more, but there are people in Latvia that hold enormous quantities of property, and it goes really undertaxed. And then that has to be made up for by taxing labor more. Work is a good thing. Work actually adds value to an economy. And so, the more you tax that, the less wealth you're creating. So Latvia needs to think about that too. And what it can do is that if you can shift more of that tax burden onto property, and again, speaking of people who are more significant holders of it, that can bring down the cost of housing. So in other words, what it would do is it would encourage developers to either develop their land and their buildings or get rid of them. All right. So if they're going to develop them, that means more housing available. That means both housing prices and rents go down. And that's a good thing for working people. So, we want to bring down the cost of necessities such as housing for people. As you know, I mean, especially with a city like Riga, far too much of its housing remains empty, remains undeveloped. There are far too many buildings which have not been developed. You've got all of that land that the Port Authority, there are people that have long-term leases on that. They don't do a thing with it. You want to force them to do something with it, develop it. Either put some buildings on it that can house people or sell it to somebody who will. And a higher tax on it will have that effect, because if you have to pay a tax on it every year, you're going to be thinking about that. Well, do I really want to hold on to this and do nothing with it because it's costing me money? I have to make that calculation. I'm just a humble professor, but I have a second home that I rent out. And given the structure of property taxes in the United States, I couldn't afford to just let it sit empty. I pay too much in the way of taxes on it. I have to keep it rented. That's a good thing. That means that somebody's getting to live there, and that reduces housing costs for everyone. So, I think Latvia needs more of that too. And again, making very clear, we're not talking about, making the, old Tanta pay more for her apartment and, Paradogova or something like that. I mean, not talking about that at all. I'm just talking about these really prime, high value properties that are just allowed to sit idle year after year with near nothing being done to them. That has to stop. It's a kind of a tax on Latvian labor and on your economy generally.
Let's be true. The value of the property is something we are creating together as a society, because I mean, we are building the infrastructure around it. We are
yes.
Yeah.
But you can make that argument for anything. I mean, you can make that argument for labor or whatever. I mean, ultimately, Latvians need to decide, just as people all over the world in developed economies have decided, do they want a low-cost, high-income economy, or do they want the reverse? If you want to keep property prices jacked way up, you're going to have a high-cost economy with low incomes, or do you want to reverse it? And we need to, again, think about this in terms of work. I'm thinking, on Choka, there's a building. I'm trying to remember the phrase in Latin, but on top of the building, of course, in Latin, it says "work conquers all." The building was built in 1910 or 13, something like that. But that sentiment is absolutely true. You want people working. You don't want an old kind of, pre-capitalist, industrialized mindset in which people are able to live off just owning property and being idle. If you're being idle, you're not working. So it's Latvia's decision to make, but you don't get rich by just holding. I mean, you as an individual can get rich by just holding property, but a country cannot. It's a way to stay less affluent than you might otherwise be.
And there is one more argument. I think that the property is a pretty simple thing to tax.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the great thing about it is that you can't avoid it. So I was just in Riga, as you know, and the banks are always funny in Riga. They have what I call the 10-year rule. So if you spoke with them in, say, 2001, oh no, let me rephrase this. Let's say if you spoke to them in 2010 and asked them about offshore banking and correspondent banking, they would say, oh no, we haven't done that in 10 years. If you spoke with them in 2020, they'll give you the same answer. Oh, we haven't done that in 10 years. Now, I suspect if you speak with them in 2030, they'll tell you, oh, we haven't done that in 10 years. So it doesn't matter when you ask them. It's always 10 years in the past. But so I see some guy gets out of his Lamborghini. He has his trophy wife. The license plates are from the Principality of Monaco. It's clear that he's in Latvia to, make use of the still existing offshore banking infrastructure, which exists here. Now it's smaller than it used to be, no doubt about that. But yes, I mean, you all land can be taxed. You know where it is. Somebody's going to have to pay it. So in other words, if you have some guy that owns huge amounts of property, he can, write down a bunch of different people's names and say, oh, they own it, I don't. But that tax is still going to be collected. So you can't avoid it. It's one of the beauties of taxing property. You can't avoid it. Thinking about the classical economic tradition, I mean, Latvians, of course, they, like a lot of people in Central and East Europe, I understand this. I mean, coming from a post-Soviet mentality, so they really embrace capitalism. Well, I can tell you from an economic history perspective, this is what capitalism is all about. In the 19th century, what separated the 19th century from the 18th century was an entire school of economic thought on markets and reducing rents, reducing costs on economies. That is what the classical economic tradition was about. And it was at this time that we saw the increase of taxes on property. Very important. Now, again, not hurting the average person here, but imposing a bigger tax burden on people that hold high value properties or a lot of property.
There's also the thesis that the pushment towards the development was creating such a construction as a company. I mean that you have a limited
a liability, right?
That was also a big push because before that we had to. I mean, if you have a debt, that you have to pay it yourself. I mean, and that was also some push towards development that, yes, I know I'm taking the risk, but still this risk is limited. I mean, I won't have my head cut off because of that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. This is very, very important. So it used to be, we had debtors, prisons, and all the rest. Now, of course, there's, criminal negligence and that kind of thing, of course, should be prosecuted. But one of the things that the literature tells us in terms of business schools is that entrepreneurs oftentimes will start 5, 6, 7, a dozen companies before they finally get it right. There's a big learning curve. So yeah, you don't want to penalize people for taking risks. Criminal risks, that's a different matter. But right, you want to have people starting businesses, learning, walking away when the whole thing goes bust, starting the next one. This time you know more, and you're likely going to do better. So yeah, this was a very big advance, especially in the United States in the 19th century. Setting up these limited liability corporations. Absolutely.